world suffers from global recession, hunger, pollution, climate change, nuclear weapons, terrorism, as well as many others. To those who say we are not really making progress, many may state that at least we've eliminated slavery. But sadly, that is not the truth. 60 years after the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights banned the slave trade worldwide, there are more people being trafficked and sold today than at any point in human history, approximately 27 million. Of all international human trafficking, approximately 75% of these people are forced into sex slavery. Trafficking women and children for sexual exploitation is the fastest growing criminal enterprise in the world. Despite the fact that sex trafficking is criminalized in 134 countries worldwide. Sex trafficking or slavery is the exploitation of women and children within national or across international borders for the purposes of forced sex work. In poor regions such as Africa, children make up the majority of people who are trafficked. Sex traffickers use violence, threats, lies, debt bondage, and other forms of coercion to compel adults and children to engage in commercial sex acts against their will. Under U.S. federal law, any minor under the age of 18 years induced into commercial sex act is a victim of sex trafficking, regardless of whether or not the trafficker used force, fraud, or coercion. Young girls from impoverished families are often deceived by traffickers who promise them a false job, while others are sold by their families. The average age of a female trafficking victim is 12 to 14 years old. Slaves are cheap and disposable. The average cost of a slave around the world is $90. Some sex trafficking is highly visible, such as street prostitution. But many trafficking victims remain unseen, operating out of unmarked brothels and unsuspecting in sometimes suburban neighborhoods. Sex traffickers may also operate out of a variety of public and private locations, such as massage parlors, spas, and strip clubs. Many of the poorest and most unstable countries have the highest incidences of human trafficking, and extreme poverty is a common bond among trafficking victims. Where economic alternatives do not exist, women and girls are more vulnerable to being tricked and coerced into sexual servitude. A stalled gender wage gap, as well as an increase in women's part-time work, push women into poorly paid jobs and long-term and hidden unemployment, which leaves women vulnerable to sex traffickers. Sex trafficking is incredibly profitable. Traffickers do not pay their slaves, so all of their revenue goes directly to profits. Yearly, the sex slave industry generates billions of dollars in profits and has one of the greatest profit margins of any industry worldwide. Based on 2007 data, the average annual profit per sex slave ranged from $11,349 in Africa up to $78,196 in West Europe, with a worldwide weighted average of $29,210. Many sex trafficking victims experience emotional trauma afterwards, such as depression, anxiety, and PTSD. Some of the health issues seen in victims are STIs, pregnancy, infections, mutilations, scars, bruises, and infectious diseases such as tuberculosis. Sex trafficking occurs everywhere, including Canada. Canada is the source country for sex tourism, and NGOs report that Canada is also a destination country, particularly for American sex tourists. Canada was among the first countries to enforce the UN's protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. Sex trafficking is an offense against the Criminal Code of Canada and the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. Victims are often brought into Canada from other parts of the world, primarily Asia and Eastern Europe. Asian victims are often trafficked to Vancouver and Western Canada, while Eastern European and Latin American victims are often trafficked to Toronto and Eastern Canada. Canada's Aboriginal female population is prostituted and trafficked in disproportionate levels. Aboriginal youth are only 3 to 5% of the Canadian population, and yet in some cities they are 90% of the visible sex trade. Often, Canadian youth are approached at airports, bus stations, malls, and offered friendship, which tricks them into trafficking. Youth is also targeted at fairs and sporting events. Those outside of Canada are promised false visitor visas, often to work, study, or get married. The majority of human trafficking victims are trafficked by someone they know and trust. The people who are victims of such forms of violence and oppression, even when horribly abused, disfigured, and dehumanized, remain human. No amount of inhumanity exercised against them can deny their right to be treated with respect and life-giving love. The Church states that every human being should be treated with dignity and respect. Human trafficking denies victims of this right. Sex trafficking is a terrible crime and it needs to be stopped. Under no circumstances is selling a human person for the purpose of sexual exploitation acceptable. So take a stand and help end